Assemblyman Matt Haney, a Democrat from San Francisco, did what we call a gut and amend. In other words, he had a Assembly Bill 2751. What does it do? This is the so-called right to disconnect bill. What it basically means is that your employer couldn't contact you during any non-working hours, and the traditional work day from 8:30 to 5, anytime before or after the start or end times, they would not be able to contact you except in an emergency or to deal with a scheduling change, and that has to be within 24 hours. Otherwise, your employee would have the right to ignore that communication during non-working hours. And the other thing is that the employee could file a complaint if there were multiple violations of your workplace policy for disconnecting, basically, from the employer. So that means an employer could be subject to be punished by a civil penalty by the California Labor Commissioner if the employer repeatedly violated the non-communication prohibition. On its face, it sounds like a potential good idea, but the practical applications may not be so good after all. I mean, for example, what happens if an employee is working on a project? Can one employee contact another employee, but their manager cannot? What happens if two or more workers have different hours that they're working? What happens if you have workers in different time zones? This blanket restriction, I think, could potentially impede some work processes and delay, activities with some employers. And remember, there are only two exceptions. The first is scheduling, which means some sort of change within 24 hours. An emergency is defined as an unforeseen situation that threatens an employee, customer, or the public, disrupts or shuts down operations, or causes physical or environmental damage. That type of an emergency is more of, again, a threat or, to the health and safety or the environment, or could shut down operations. But that's not always what we, potentially have to deal with. For example, what about those instances where a business may have to meet certain deadlines or ensure that productivity, levels remain? The fact that an employer could be subject to a civil penalty by the labor commissioner, not only is there a concern for that financial penalty, but also the fact that would likely be, a matter of public record then. So if an employer got such a civil penalty, would people look at that employer as, they must be very difficult to work with because they contact employees outside of normal working hours? This one-size-fits-all approach that the bill takes doesn't take into consideration some of the operational realities that we have in different sectors of our economy. And, business, especially those who are competing on an international basis, need flexibility and, agility to modify its processes or in order to meet certain deadlines. And that definition of emergency sure doesn't take those types of operations into consideration. This is all employers, regardless of size. And it also applies to the public sector, the state executive branch, and municipalities like city and county government. It does not, however, apply to the legislature. It also doesn't apply to someone who has a collective bargaining agreement, that they're a member of a union, for example. One of the shortcomings in this bill is that employer doesn't distinguish between say a manager, a supervisor, the CEO. Employer is simply defined as the state or a political subdivision or a municipality. So does that mean, the CEO, or does that mean your supervisor? Does that even mean a colleague, for example, cannot contact you after hours or before you start work, for example? So that's how broad this language is. An employee is not defined, but obviously that is somebody who is employed in the private sector or in the public sector. It is interesting to note that the legislature is not subject to this particular bill. So this is one of 9 bills that the California Chamber of Commerce has designated as a job killer. This bill, it definitely faces some hurdles, as you might imagine. I think it's gotten a lot of public interest. And the concept of do not disturb, I think a lot of folks probably enjoy. Well, this bill has definitely gotten national attention, and I think the author, Assemblyman Haney, has definitely gotten a lot of press coverage on the bill so far. Although the concept of a right to disconnect is popular, I think this bill may have some tough sledding because it is so broad. A lot of those terms, like employer, really need to be fine-tuned. And the fact that it would affect both the public and private sectors, I think, could be problematic for the bill. So this is one of those ones that I think it may sound good at the outset, but once you figure out how it may work practically, I think folks will hopefully appreciate that it could be very onerous for both public and private sector employers in the state of California. There's potentially significant costs that need to be considered for the public sector. You may recall that in the California legislature, they're less concerned with potential costs on private sector employers, but definitely concerned with the cost to the state, the executive branch that employs, about 240,000 individuals in the state. And of course, the several 100,000 that local governments in this state also employ, and what the implications of this right to disconnect could be on the public sector employees, and whether or not it'll actually end up costing the state and local governments a significant amount of money to comply with this law.
If you haven't checked out CaliforniaInsider.com, we highly recommend you do that now, because we're going to have a lot of news and videos there. And on top of what we have there right now, we are building a really big platform to cover what's happening in California, so you can be informed. We're going to have more shows, more videos from all aspects of life in California. Go to CaliforniaInsider.com and we'll see you there.